When I saw my "No Public Access" sign drifting sideways through the water like a little plastic tombstone, I knew somebody had not only crossed the line, they had whipped the line out of the ground and thrown it in the creek. And the ugly part was, I already knew who had done it. My name is Nolan Price, and 3 months before that morning, I bought a small place outside Roanoke, Virginia, the kind of place you find after one divorce, 2 bad jobs, and enough city noise to make silence feel like a luxury item. It was not a mansion, not even close, just a cedar-sided house with a sagging porch, 6 acres of uneven ground, and a cold spring branch running behind it through a patch of hardwoods that smelled like wet leaves and old stone after rain. That branch was what sold me, not the kitchen, not the workshop, not the little guest cabin that leaned slightly to the left like it had an opinion. It was the water, clear as glass in the shallow parts, slow in the bends, just loud enough over the rocks to make a man feel like maybe the world could mind its own business for once. I'd spent 15 years running a small towing company in Richmond, which meant my phone rang at 2 in the morning more than church bells ring on Sunday. And when I finally sold the business, I told myself I was done with other people's emergencies. I wanted coffee on the porch, muddy boots by the door, a dog eventually, maybe tomatoes, if I could figure out how not to murder plants with good intentions, and mostly, I wanted a piece of ground where nobody came walking up with a clipboard telling me what color peace and quiet was supposed to be. That last part mattered because just over the ridge from my place sat Briar Hollow Estates, a gated little neighborhood with stone pillars at the entrance and lawns trimmed so sharp they looked nervous. And running the show over there was the Briar Hollow Property Association, which everybody nearby still called the HOA, even though half the folks saying it were rolling their eyes before they finished the sentence. At the center of that little kingdom was Marlene Whitaker, a woman in her late 50s who dressed like she was always on her way to fire somebody at a country club. Pearl earrings, white visor, spotless sneakers that had clearly never met honest dirt, and a smile so polished it made you check your pockets afterward. She came by my first week with a welcome basket, and I will admit, for about 30 seconds I thought I had misjudged her, because there were muffins in there, blueberry, still warm, and I am not too proud to say a warm muffin can lower a man's defenses. Then she looked past my shoulder at my porch and said, "Nolan, you know, natural wood tones are charming, but Briar Hollow encourages a more unified exterior palette." And I said, "Well, that is good to know, but I am not in Briar Hollow." She blinked at me like I had burped during a hymn. "Oh," she said, with that soft little laugh people use when they are about to ignore reality. "You are adjacent, and adjacent properties affect community standards." Now, I had not fully studied every line of my deed yet, but I knew enough to know adjacent did not mean owned, and encouraged did not mean required. So I gave her the kind of smile you give a stranger who has wandered into your driveway with a misunderstanding and a muffin basket, and I told her I would keep that in mind. Over the next few weeks, she kept keeping it in my mind for me. A note appeared in my mailbox about my truck being visible from the private road, which was impressive since my truck was on my land and the private road was not private to her eyes, apparently. Then came a printed complaint about my brush pile being unsightly from certain viewing angles, which sounded like a crime committed by geometry. Then one Saturday morning, while I was repairing a section of fence near the spring branch, Marlene stopped at the property line with 2 of her regular shadows, Ruthie Bell and Claire Donahue, both carrying travel mugs and expressions that said they had never once been told no in a way that stuck. Marlene pointed toward the water and said, "That little stream is such a missed opportunity. You know, our residents have been asking for more nature access." And I said, "That little stream is mine." I did not say it ugly, just plain. It is in the survey, it is in the deed. From the stone culvert up by the old county lane down to the split hickory past the Ben, both banks and access rights belong to me. Ruthie gave a tiny laugh, the kind you could barely hear but still somehow feel insulted by, and Clara said, "Water is kind of communal though, is it not?" I looked at her and said, "Rain is communal, ma'am. My creek bank is not." That should have been the end of it, but people like Marlene do not hear boundaries as stopping points, they hear them as challenges. Over the next month, I noticed little things: grass pressed down near the back trail, a candy wrapper by the rocks. One of those expensive dog waste bags tied neatly to a branch like that made it less ridiculous, and every time I told myself not to be paranoid, that maybe wind did it, deer did it, A raccoon with refined shopping habits did it. Something else would show up. So, I put up 2 signs. Not hostile, not ugly, just simple, no public access. Private property. And I mounted a small trail camera in a cedar tree, mostly because I had owned tow trucks long enough to know that when people start acting confused about what belongs to them, a camera can be a better conversationalist than you are. Then came that morning. Grey sky, muddy ground, coffee in one hand, and my sign fudging down the branch like it had quit the job before I did. I followed it upstream with my boot sinking into the bank, and the closer I got to the bend, the more I heard voices, laughing, ice clinking. Some kind of smooth saxophone music drifting through the trees like the world's most annoying elevator had crashed in my woods. When I stepped through the brush, there they were. Marlene Whitaker, Ruthie, Claire, and 2 men I recognized from the Briar Hollow board were sitting in folding chairs on my creek bank. Not near it, not accidentally beside it, on it. They had a cooler open, fishing poles in the water, a blue umbrella stuck into the mud, and somebody had laid a little outdoor rug over the moss like they were staging a catalog photo called Trespassing with Lemonade. For a second I just stood there because your brain has to resize itself around certain levels of nerve. Marlene saw me first and lifted her hand in a tiny pageant wave. "Nolan, there you are," she said, like I was late to a party I had not been invited to on land I owned. I asked her what she thought she was doing, and she smiled, not friendly now, just thin. "We are enjoying the branch," she said. "The board discussed it last week, and we agreed this area serves as a natural extension of Briar Hollow's green corridor." I almost laughed, and maybe I did a little, because green corridor sounded like something a man says right before he steals your lawnmower with a grand proposal. I told her, "Marlene, you cannot vote yourselves access to my property." She took off her sunglasses very slowly, like we were in court and she had been waiting for this scene all her life. "Nolan," she said, "you need to understand something. Your land affects our property values. Your branch feeds into our drainage system, and our families deserve safe outdoor space." That was the first time I heard the real reason under all the polite nonsense. It was not about nature, not really. It was about control, about a group of people who had sold their residence on a perfect little mountain lifestyle and decided my quiet patch of woods would make a nice amenity if they could bully me into pretending it was theirs. One of the men, a red-faced guy named Kent Rowley, leaned back in his chair and said, "Nobody is hurting anything, friend." Well, I said, "You tore down my sign." Claire looked into her cup like the answer might be floating in there. Ruthie said, "Those signs felt aggressive." "Aggressive," I said, "is sitting on another man's land with a cooler and calling it community wellness." Marlene's face tightened then, just for a second, fast enough that most people might have missed it, but I saw it. The little flash of anger when a person used to being obeyed realizes charm is not working. She stood up, brushed imaginary dirt off her pants, and said, "We have been accessing this area for several weeks without incident, so perhaps the reasonable thing is to formalize an understanding." Several weeks. That phrase landed in me harder than the trespassing itself. Several weeks meant this was not a mistake, not a neighbor wandering too far, not some misunderstanding about a trail. This was organized, repeated, and confident, which meant they had either convinced themselves I would not fight, or they were hoping I would not know how. I looked at the chairs, the fishing lines, the cooler, the little rug, that stupid umbrella leaning in my mud, and I felt something settle inside me. Not rage exactly, more like a door closing. I said, "Pack it up." Kent started to stand like he wanted to argue, but Marlene touched his arm and gave me that polished smile again. "Of course," she said. "We can revisit this when everyone is calmer." I told her, "I am calm. That is the part you should worry about." Then I turned around and walked back to my house. Snow, because nothing makes small tyrants more nervous than a man who stops yelling and starts collecting proof. By the time I reached my kitchen, my coffee was cold. My boots had tracked mud across the floor, and my hands were steady in a way that surprised me. I opened my laptop, pulled up the trail camera feed, and started scrolling backward through the footage. 1 day, 3 days, a week, 2 weeks. And at first it was just the usual woods movie. Squirrels, deer, wind, a fox at dawn slipping past like a secret. But then the screen changed. Marlene appeared in the frame carrying a rolled-up map tube, Kent behind her with a shovel, another board member dragging a bag of gravel. And as I watched what they did next, Sitting alone in that quiet kitchen with the spring branch whispering outside the window, I realized this was not a neighbor dispute anymore. This was bigger, uglier, and a whole lot more deliberate than a stolen sign. Marlene appeared in the frame carrying a rolled-up map tube, Kent behind her with a shovel, another board member dragging a bag of gravel, and I remember leaning closer to that laptop, like getting my face near the screen might somehow make the footage less real. But it did not. It only made every little detail worse. The timestamp said Tuesday, 8:43 in the morning, a week and a half before I found them fishing, and there they were walking my creek bank like they had keys to the place. Marlene unrolled a paper on the flat rock by the water, tapped it with one red fingernail, and Kent pointed toward the bend where the bank dipped low and muddy. I could not hear them. The trail camera did not catch audio from that distance, but body language has its own language. There said planning, not wandering. Kent started digging near the root line of a young maple, cutting into the bank with sharp little jabs, while the other board member, a skinny retired dentist named Howard Lacey, opened a bag of pea gravel and poured it along the path as casual as if he were salting a driveway. Then Marlene stepped back, hands on hips, admiring it. I sat there with my cold coffee and felt my stomach go tight, because that was my land they were reshaping. My water they were directing. My quiet little stretch of earth they had decided needed improvement. I kept scrolling. 2 days later, they came back with landscape timbers. 3 days after that, a woman I did not know brought 6 kids down there with towels around their necks, and those kids ran straight into the branch, splashing, slipping on rocks, yelling like kids do when nobody has told them they are standing inside a lawsuit waiting to happen. One boy climbed onto a low branch and jumped into water barely deep enough to cover a tire, and I actually said out loud, "Alone in my kitchen? No, because all I could see was a broken arm, a cracked head, a parent crying, and then some lawyer pointing at my deed and asking why I had not kept people off my property." That was the moment anger finally found its legs. Not the sign, not the chairs, not even Marlene's smug little green corridor speech. It was seeing children placed in danger on my land by adults who wanted an amenity without responsibility. I copied everything. I pulled still images. I exported clips. I backed them up on a drive. Then another drive, because when people build lies for a living, the first thing they attack is evidence. By noon, I had a folder on my desktop called Briar Hollow Trespass, and by 1 o'clock, I had called the one person I knew who would not tell me to calm down just because a woman with pearls was involved. Her name was Dana Kincaid, an attorney over in Salem, and she had handled the sale when I bought the place. Dana had one of those voices that made you sit up straighter, even over the phone. Calm, dry, not impressed by much. I sent her 3 clips and waited while she watched them. For a while, all I heard was clicking, then silence. Then she said, "Nolan, how attached are you to being polite?" I said, "Less by the minute." She said, "Good, because this is trespass, property damage, possible environmental violation, and if they knowingly brought residents onto that bank, they may have exposed you to liability while representing they had authority they do not have." I asked her if Briar Hollow had any claim at all to the spring branch, and she gave this little laugh that had no humor in it. "A Putu title file," she said. "Your parcel is outside their association. Not loosely outside, not technically grey. Outside, you are not a member. Your land is not subject to their covenanters, and unless there is an easement I have not seen, they have about as much legal right to your creek as I have to your refrigerator." I do not know why that hit me so hard, but it did. Maybe because for weeks I had let those notes, those comments, those little drive-by inspections make me feel like I was missing some rule everyone else understood. Maybe because men like me, men who work with their hands and keep their heads down, are trained by life to assume the person with printed letterhead probably knows something we do not. But hearing Dana say it plain lifted a weight off my chest and replaced it with something sharper. They had been bluffing. Worse, they'd been bluffing with confidence. Dana told me not to confront them again, not in the driveway, not at the creek, not through email. "Let paper do the talking," she said. "People like this love emotional reactions because emotional reactions look messy. Clean evidence scares them." So that afternoon I called the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office and reported what I had. Deputy Sam Tiller showed up just before sunset, a broad-shouldered man with tired eyes and the voice like gravel in a coffee can. He stood in my kitchen watching clip after clip on my laptop, arms crossed, jaw working slow. When the footage of the kids came on, he muttered something under his breath. "I will not repeat here," then looked at me and said, "You want them warned or charged?" I asked him what he would do if it were his land. He looked out my back window toward the trees and said, "I would charge them before somebody gets hurt, and they blame me for it." So that is what we did. Statements, copies of footage, photos of the bank, photos of the missing sign, photos of the gravel and timber work. Deputy Tiller walked the creek with me, and when we got to the little path they had built, he crouched down, touched the fresh gravel, and shook his head like he had seen this kind of stupidity before, but still had not made peace with it. The next morning, notice went out. By lunch, Briar Hollow was buzzing like somebody had kicked a hornet nest in church clothes. I know because my nearest neighbor, Earl Pruitt, came over pretending to ask if I had seen his wandering beagle, which was funny because that dog had been dead for 2 years, and Earl knew I knew it. Earl was 74, retired from the railroad, built like a fence post, and he had a way of delivering gossip like it was weather. He leaned on my porch rail and said, "Heard Marlene got a visit." I said, "Sounds like she did." He nodded toward the ridge. "Folks up there are nervous." I asked why. Earl looked at me like I had just asked why rain was wet. Because half of them had been waiting for somebody to make her bleed paperwork. That was the first crack in the wall. Over the next few days, people started showing up in quiet little waves, not with pitchforks, not making speeches, just regular people carrying years of swallowed frustration. A schoolteacher named Grace told me Briar Hollow fined her mother $300 for leaving Christmas lights up until January 10th, even though her mother had been in the hospital having surgery. A young guy named Matteo said they threatened to tow his work van because the logo on the side was visually commercial, whatever that means. A widower named Tom had been forced to repaint his fence twice because Marlene decided the first approved color looked different in afternoon light. Every story had the same shape, a small rule stretched into a weapon, a fee attached to fear, a polite letter with teeth behind it. And somewhere in all that, I stopped feeling like one man protecting a creek and started feeling like the first loose thread in a sweater people had hated wearing for years. Dana helped me put everything in order, not just my footage. But there's stories too, dated, printed, labeled. She filed for an injunction to keep Briar Hollow officers and residents off my parcel. She also sent a formal demand letter that was so clean and cold I almost felt bad for whoever had to read it. Almost. It laid out the trespass, the unauthorized alterations, the liability exposure, the lack of jurisdiction, and a demand for restoration costs. Marlene responded 2 days later through the association's attorney, claiming the Spring Branch had been historically understood as shared recreational space. That phrase, historically understood, became my favorite piece of nonsense for a while, because there is nothing like fancy language to dress up the fact that you got caught stealing access to water. Dana read the letter over the phone and said, "They are trying to make confusion where the documents are clear." Then she paused and added, "Nolan, they also included something interesting." I asked what. She said they're requesting a county reassessment of your property based on unpermitted recreational improvements. I actually laughed, loud enough that my own kitchen sounded surprised. "The improvements they built," I said. "Exactly," Dana said. "They're hoping the county sees gravel, timbers and trail use, then makes this your problem before anyone asks who put them there." It was petty, it was cowardly, and somehow it was exactly what I expected from Marlene. But what she did not know, what none of them knew, was that the county was already looking at the sheriff's report, and that little reassessment request did not bury the issue. It put a flashing red arrow over it. 2 mornings later, a county land inspector named Paul Riddick came by, carrying a tablet, survey maps, and the peaceful expression of a man who ruins bad plans for a living. He was polite, quiet, and painfully thorough. We walked the boundary from the old culvert to the split hickory, then back up along the branch. He checked markers I'd never noticed, metal pins under leaves, old stone corners, faded ribbons half swallowed by brush. After about 40 minutes, he looked at me and said, "Your line is exactly where your deed says it is." I said, "Good." He said, "For you, yes." Then he turned toward the ridge, toward Briar Hollow's side of the trees, and his face changed just a little. He pointed to a cleared patch beyond my fence where Briar Hollow had put in a little pollinator garden with benches and a wooden sign that said, "Residents Restore Nature." Paul zoomed his tablet map and said, "That is not theirs." I asked whose it was. He said, County conservation buffer. Nobody should have built anything there. I remember standing there with mud on my boots, and this slow, almost guilty satisfaction spreading through me, because Marlene had tried to drag the county onto my land, and instead the county had turned around and found her fingerprints on public ground. Within a week, code enforcement was out there. Then environmental quality. Then a stormwater specialist who looked at the gravel near my branch and said somebody really did not know what they were doing. The gravel had changed runoff flow into the spring branch, and the timbers had disturbed protected bank vegetation. Harold Voss, a retired biology professor who lived 2 roads over, came by one evening with a folder thick enough to stop a door. He had been photographing muddy runoff from Briar Hollow for months, quietly, patiently, the way older men collect proof when nobody listens the first 3 times. He told me they always called me difficult. I said, "Welcome to the club." He smiled for the first time and said, "Difficult is what they call you right before you are proven right." That line stayed with me. The whole thing began moving faster after that, faster than Marlene could charm, threaten, or let her head her way around. Briar Hollow's attorney withdrew, which in lawyer language is sometimes the sound of a ship taking on water. Board members started distancing themselves from decisions they had signed. Kent claimed he thought they had verbal permission, which was news to my ears and apparently to his own emails. Howard said Marlene handled the details. Ruthie told one neighbor she had only attended the Creek days socially, as if trespassing came with a social exemption. And then Dana called me on a Thursday night, later than usual, a voice lower than I had heard it before. "Nolan," she said, "this is not just land anymore." I sat down before she finished, because something in her tone told me the floor might be useful. She had gotten copies of financial records from a group of Briar Hollow residents who had finally demanded access. There were reimbursements for trail maintenance materials that did not match the materials on my bank. There were checks to a landscaping outfit owned by Kent's brother-in-law. There were equipment rentals billed on days when no equipment had been rented. Small amounts at first, then bigger ones, tucked between flower budgets and clubhouse repairs like nobody would notice if the spreadsheet looked boring enough. And right there in the middle of it all was a line item labeled Nature Access Enhancement, approved by Marlene Whitaker, Kent Rowley, and Howard Lacey. The date matched the first morning on my trail camera. I sat there holding the phone, staring through the window at the dark trees beyond my porch, and I understood then that my creek had never been the whole price. It was the cover story, the pretty thing they could point at while money moved, rules bent, and people got trained to obey. Dana said the county investigator wants your full footage archived tomorrow. I looked toward the sound of the spring branch, black and silver under the moon, still moving like it had no idea how much trouble it had caused. And I said, "I will bring everything." The next morning, I walked into the county annex with a hard drive in my jacket pocket, and the strange feeling that I was carrying something heavier than plastic and wires. Dana was already there, sitting in the lobby with a yellow legal pad on her knee, looking calm enough to make everybody else in the room nervous. She took one look at me and said, "Do not embellish, do not guess, do not get cute. Just tell them what you saw and give them what you have." I told her I was not exactly known for getting cute before 9 in the morning, and she almost smiled. Inside the conference room were Deputy Tiller, a county investigator named Melissa Grant, Paul Reddick from Land Inspection, and a man from Environmental Quality who had the tired expression of somebody who had spent his whole career explaining to rich people that creeks are not decorative plumbing. They asked questions for nearly 2 hours. When did I first notice people on the bank? When did the sign go missing? Had I ever given verbal permission? Had anyone from Briar Hollow offered to pay for access? Had Marlene ever implied the land belonged to the association? Every answer made the room quieter. Not dramatic quiet, just that official kind of quiet where people start understanding the shape of a thing. Then Melissa plugged in the hard drive, and we watched the footage again. Marlene pointing at maps, Kent digging into the bank, Howard spreading gravel, children running through the water, residents stepping around my sign like it was an inconvenience instead of a warning. I had seen it all before. But watching other people watch it changed something. It made the violation feel less personal and more real, like the world was finally agreeing that I had not imagined the line being crossed. By the end of that week, Briar Hollow was no longer whispering. It was cracking. Residents demanded an emergency meeting at the cophouse, and against Dana's advice, I went, not to argue, not to speak, just to sit in the back and look Marlene Whitaker in the eye while her kingdom shook under fluorescent lights. The room was packed. Folding chairs, paper cups of coffee, people standing along the walls with their arms crossed. Marlene sat at the front table in a cream-colored blazer, pearls perfect, hair sprayed into submission, but her hands kept moving, straightening papers, touching her pen, folding and unfolding a napkin. Kent would not look at anyone. Howard looked like he wanted to crawl into the carpet and come back as dust. Marlene opened with that sugary voice of hers, saying there had been misunderstandings, outside agitation, unfortunate miscommunication involving land use and community wellness. Earl, who had come along because he said he enjoyed public theater when the villain wore perfume, leaned toward me and whispered, "Community wellness is what they call it when they get caught with a shovel." Then Grace, the schoolteacher, stood up and asked why association funds had been used for nature access enhancements on land Briar Hollow did not own. Marlene said the board had acted in good faith. Mateo stood next and asked why checks had gone to Kent's brother-in-law. Kent muttered that it was a vendor relationship. Tom, the widower, raised his hand and said, "Funny how every mistake around here seems to pay somebody related to the board." That was when the room turned. You could feel it, like the air had shifted direction. Marlene tried to regain control, tapping a microphone, saying this was not a courtroom. But she had forgotten something important. People who've been afraid for years do not stay afraid forever once they realize the bully is bleeding. The meeting ended with shouting. 3 resignations threatened, and Marlene walking out through the side door with her chin high and her face pale. 4 days later, she was arrested. No movie music, no screaming, no dramatic chase, just 2 sheriff's vehicles pulling up in front of her brick house at 7:15 on a Tuesday morning while sprinklers ticked across perfect grass. I was not there when it happened, but by noon everybody had seen the photos from someone's upstairs window. Marlene in sunglasses, no visor this time, wrists in front of her, Deputy Tiller beside her, guiding her toward the car with one hand near her elbow. Kent was charged the following week. Howard took a deal after that, and once financial crimes got involved, the pretty little paperwork wall Briar Hollow had built started falling in whole sections. Misuse of funds, falsified reimbursements, unauthorized land alterations, false statements tied to permits. It all came out like water finding cracks. I thought that would be the end of it. Honestly, I wanted it to be. I wanted to go back to being a man with muddy boots in the quiet branch behind his house, not the reluctant mascot for everyone who had ever hated an HOA meeting. But trouble has a way of leaving one more envelope in the mailbox. About 3 weeks after Marlene's arrest, I got a certified letter from the county tax assessor saying my parcel had been flagged for an unreported recreational structure. Attached was a grainy aerial photo showing a wooden platform near a bend in the trees. For a full minute, I just stared at it, trying to make the shape fit my land. And then I realized the bend was wrong. The water curved east there, not west. That structure was not on my property. It was just beyond my lower boundary, inside the county conservation buffer, tucked behind Mountain Laurel where you could not see it unless you knew where to look. I drove down the old service road that afternoon with Dana on speakerphone and Earl riding shotgun because he said if there was another stupid sign, he wanted to see my face when I found it. We pushed through brush, followed the branch, and there it was, a 10 by 12 wooden deck on posts, railing on 3 sides, fresh stain, little solar lights along the edge, and a carved sign screwed to the front that read Briar Hollow Reflection Overlook. Under that, in smaller letters, Private Association Property. Earl laughed once, sharp and mean, and said, "Well, they reflected themselves right into a felony." Dana did not laugh. She told me to photograph everything and touch nothing. By the next day, she had pulled the permit application, and there it was, in black and white, my parcel number, my legal description used as supporting access, my land quietly borrowed on paper so Briar Hollow could build on county-protected ground and pretend the project sat inside some harmless grey area. That one made me cold in a way the creek footage had not. Trespassing was bold. Cutting into my bank was reckless. But using my parcel number felt intimate, like somebody had reached into my file cabinet, taken my name, and signed it onto their lie. The county moved fast after that because fraud on public land is a way of making government offices suddenly discover urgency. The overlook came down in one morning. A crew arrived with pry bars and saws. Deputies watching from the road. Residents gathered at a distance, quiet as church. They pulled the rails first, then the floorboards, then the posts, one by one. and every crack of lumber sounded like a period at the end of a sentence. Marlene had been writing for years. By late afternoon, there was nothing left but disturbed soil and a rectangle of lighter dirt. A week later, Briar Hollow Property Association was placed under outside oversight, then dissolved after the remaining residents voted not to rebuild it under another name. The funds that could be recovered went back into a restitution pool. The county restored the buffer. Harold helped select native plants for the branch banks. Earl brought a shovel and complained the whole time, which was how I knew he was enjoying himself. I planted a young river birch near the spot where my sign had been torn down, and for a while I just stood there listening to the water move around the rocks, steady, unconcerned, like it had outlasted better fools than us. These days, the branch is quiet again. No folding chairs, no coolers, no jazz music floating through my woods, no woman in pearls telling me my private land is a community feeling, just trees, water, mud, and the occasional raccoon committing crimes no court will prosecute. But I will tell you what I still think about. None of this started with money, or permits, or fraud charges. It started with one boundary that somebody decided did not matter because the person behind it looked easier to pressure than to respect. And maybe that is how most ugly things begin, not with a villain twirling a mustache, but with polite people making selfish exceptions until the exceptions become a system. So I want to know what you think. Did I go too far by pressing charges and helping tear down the whole association? Or was that the only way to stop people who had mistaken silence for permission? If you were standing on that creek bank, watching your own sign drift away in the water, would you let it go to keep peace with the neighbors? Or would you make enough noise that everybody finally had to look at the truth? Drop your opinion in the comments, because I have learned one thing for sure. Justice and peace are not always the same thing, and sometimes the only way to get one is to disturb the other first.